submitted for the approval of the Midnight Society. I call this story The Tale of Terror's Legacy. Imagine, if you will, the year 1990. Children's television network Nickelodeon is looking to establish and expand its programming further, and so it engages in a joint venture with a Canadian company to produce Are You Afraid of the Dark? A children's horror anthology series which has become a frighteningly enjoyable part of many people's most nostalgic memories. That's right, kids. I started this Hallowvember, more or less, talking about one of the absolute bangers of children's anthology horror, and I'm ending it off talking about another, arguably the better one, honestly, in terms of like consistency and production and stuff. And just like with Goosebumps earlier this month, I'm talking about a reboot of this classic series, one that I didn't even know existed until I started researching the Goosebumps reboot. And I read about this one online, where people were kind of comparing the quality of them. And my God, I'm so sad that I missed out on this one first run, because while there is still a little bit of buzz around, going around online amongst mostly people who were fans of the series about a fourth season, that's starting to look more like the buzz going around online amongst fans of Legends of Tomorrow about it getting picked up again. Which is to say, it's looking like that's not going to happen. And what an absolute goddamn shame. Because this is a genuinely excellent show. I have so far only watched the 3-episode first season. And I know the subsequent seasons, they don't just change the narrative, they change the cast too. And I might not like them as much. Because, man, I really took to this cast. I thought these were some great characters played by some great actors. But, man, this was just such a good show from start to finish. I liked this so much. For the 3.5 of you who aren't aware, the premise of Are You Afraid of the Dark is that the anthology element comes in through the stories told by the recurring characters at meetings of the Midnight Society, a late-night horror club that meets in secret. They're all kids, like high school age kids, who meet up at midnight around a campfire to tell each other scary stories. And while I do know that it kind of fell off towards the end, primarily, especially towards the start of the original series, each member of the Midnight Society, their stories had consistent themes that carried through from one story to the next, or they would bring some aspect of themselves into the protagonists of their stories. And so even though we didn't get a ton of the Midnight Society members, they did have distinct personalities. They had to. Because one of the things that the showrunners cared about was making sure that aspects of the Midnight Society members' personalities made it into the stories that were told. And you can't do that unless the Midnight Society members have consistent and apparent personalities. And I don't remember a ton of the, overarching stuff, like those characterizations from my time watching the show. I mostly watched this show in reruns, but man, it was so much fun. I remember really liking it. I thought the vibe of these, we wouldn't use the term at the time, these super extra kids going out and pouring so much of themselves into something they love. I thought that was just really cool. I would have been so down to be part of the Midnight Society at that age. And on top of that, the stories that they told tended to have some kind of lesson buried in them. The point of the story, aside from being scary, usually seemed to be to convey something that the storyteller was trying to get across in their real life. So while there wasn't really an overarching story, we didn't interact with these kids away from the Midnight Society, you could still glean things about who they were and the lives that they lead and what they were going through and how they were progressing as people. It was really clever, is my point. And maybe it's not as clever as I remember it being, but I remember it being a really clever show. In fact, I'm really amping for a rewatch at this point. I might just watch through the entire series at some point. And if I do, maybe that's something I'll take you guys with me on the channel. And while I kind of wish that they had kept more to that for the reboot, what they did with it was so clever. Instead of each episode being a story told by one of the characters, each season starts with one of the characters telling a story, and then the rest of the season is the characters dealing with what appears to be real supernatural elements that derive from that story, or the story was derived from them without the storyteller necessarily realizing. And that is so cool, especially in this first season, because the supernatural element in this first season is an evil horror-themed carnival, which I would have eaten that up as a kid. I'd probably still eat that up now, frankly, because carnivals are already a little unsettling. And then, basically a haunted house carnival is that's another unsettling thing on top of it. And you guys know I like horror imagery, and this is supposedly kid-friendly horror imagery, even though it's an evil carnival. But this is a thing that you were supposed to bring your kids to, so it's got that in spades, and I love it. I think it's just a fantastic idea. If this is not a thing that a real person is doing, somebody needs to get on it immediately. And the carnival ringmaster, for lack of a better term, is a guy named Mr. Top Hat, whose catchphrase is, "Don't worry, it's all part of the show." He even, at the end of the first episode, breaks the fourth wall and tells us, "Don't worry, it's all part of the show." Immediately after the setup of this season happens, the main character, Rachel, tells her story of being a young, she doesn't say it's her, but it clearly was her, of being a young girl whose parents take her to the Carnival of Doom. And even though she sees some things that seem to be genuine horror things there, for the most part she enjoys herself. But then she has a real scare, and two middle school girls go to investigate it to prove that she's being a whiny little baby, but still. And then they disappear the next day. And then no one in town remembers that the carnival even existed. And even she kind of feels like it was more akin to a nightmare than a real thing. And yet she's still certain that they actually went. Certain enough that she tells her parents those girls who disappeared were at the carnival. And it's an unsettling story. And a fun story. It's a fun, short horror story. And, I don't think the imagery here is going to give any grown-ups nightmares, but, kids would find this pretty creepy. And so, this is a show that does exactly what I suggested the Goosebumps reboot should have done, and it makes itself accessible to both adults who watch the original show and kids who might want to watch something similar now so that they could watch it together and experience it together. Because you're going to be able to point at it and say, hey, those are the elements of the thing I liked when I was a kid. It's so cool that they're doing that, but then they're also doing this different stuff. And hey, my kid is getting a kick out of this too, because it's specifically geared towards them. And I absolutely love Mr. Top Hat. He has this charming presence just immediately. He's immediately captivating as a character. But also, dude's putting on a pretty creepy performance. One that, maybe you'd have to do a double take to tell if it's actually creepy or not, but initially, first thoughts, he's kind of a creepy guy, but he works at a horror-themed carnival. That's his job. And hey, he seems nice enough. Part of the story is that they go to kind of this orientation thing under a big top, where he tells everybody that it's all a show, and the lights go out. And clearly that wasn't part of the show, so he goes up into the stands, and he jump scares the kids a little bit, but then he's talking specifically to Rachel here. He reassures her that nothing here is real, it's all part of the show. Which is exactly the kind of thing that someone with this specific job would do. He would stay in character, but still reassure the kids at the event that none of it's real, that they don't have to actually worry. And so as this is going on, you kind of wonder, well, did she actually see the things that she saw, or is she remembering them wrong? Did she just get spooked enough that she came home and her dreams kind of filled in the rest? Maybe the kids that she saw on the TV even kind of wormed their way retroactively into her dream, and those kids weren't actually at the carnival at all. The only thing that makes her story seem like it could be not all just the imaginings of a child, is the fact that at the end, the parents and the rest of the town don't remember that the carnival existed in the first place, and that then by the end of the episode, the carnival comes to town here too, and one of her classmates disappears again. Also, based on one of the motifs here, it seems like Mr. Top Hat is coming for Rachel specifically. And that's what the rest of season 1 is about. Rather than meeting at the Midnight Society and telling stories, the kids try to defeat this evil carnival. And, like, there's even, like, it's not specifically what they're doing, but there's this scene where they're discussing, like, tropes. Like, horror tropes, and this has to work this way because that's the trope. Like, they don't use that specific terminology, but that's what the discussion is, and it's very meta. And I'm thinking, like, that's why Mr. Top Hat addresses us at the end of the first episode. This is a show. And it's not trying to ever stop entirely feeling like a show. It wants us to be immersed, but this is still a kids' horror show. They don't want to scare kids for real, so it wants to feel a bit like a show the whole way through. So there are tropes and motifs, and like even the Midnight Society members all have the last names of like horror icons. It feels very much like a presentation, and it simultaneously keeps it from becoming too real, while also being clever in that kind of way that only something that's a little tongue-in-cheek can be clever. And yet it never ceases to be immersive either. The production values on this thing are absolutely fantastic. Direction was great, and the score, the music, beautiful. Not to mention that this series and the Goosebumps reboot succeed in one very similar way, that being that the Midnight Society members, when we meet them, save for the one cute guy neighbor character who we don't really get to know much until the end of the first episode, we kind of get his introduction, his real introduction there. Every single one of them, including Rachel, who has to carry the entire show on her back, makes a very strong impression. They're all immediately likable, quirky characters who are a lot of fun to follow through the rest of the show. And we get a real solid beat on who they are immediately. I particularly like how Rachel manages to embody the sort of everyman character. Like she's starting in a new school. She's awkward. She has trouble making friends. She's not sure if she's going to fit in, and she has interests that seem unusual to other people. A lot of us can relate to that, and yet she's not a blank slate. She's not just a mannequin for us to project ourselves onto. She has a personality of her own. Part of her story is that eventually, the girl from the story, her, forgot about the carnival too, which is supposed to be her way of saying that even she started to believe that it was a nightmare. And that's why she feels okay using it as the basis for her story, which earns her entry into the Midnight Society. And yet, from the beginning of the episode, we know that she's still, at least to a degree, genuinely traumatized by this. She still has nightmares about it. Like, there's other imagery in that opening nightmare too, but some of that imagery is centered around Mr. Top Hat. Frankly, the only weakness of the show is the fact that the second season has more episodes. I haven't watched it yet, but it has more episodes. But the first and the final seasons only have 3 episodes apiece. And they're relatively long episodes, but that's not enough, man. Even overlooking the fact that I wish they had worked in the story anthology motif more, I wish we had gotten to spend more time with these kids. Like, I definitely want to watch season 2, but I'm kind of dreading moving on to season 2. Because I don't want to move on from these characters. I like them. I like them enough that I want to see more of them. And slowing down the narrative of this first season and giving us, like, let's call them what they would be, filler episodes where other members of the Midnight Society tell their stories and maybe we work the themes of those stories into the ongoing narrative of the season, that would have fixed that. That would have given us more of them. And I think it would have made for a better show overall, which is weird to say, because this is already like an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10 show. It's an absolute banger. If you haven't checked it out, you absolutely should. Like, some of these characters don't land as hard as others, but I think you will get a kick out of at least half the group. Well, like rounded up or down, because you know what I mean. Like, I particularly like the character of Graham, who's the one who originally scouts Rachel as a member. He is so into the horror thing that he wears, like, watch horror movies sweatshirts to school and stuff. And yet he's the one who's most easily scared. But he genuinely likes to be scared. So he's cool with it. Like, he's not the typical coward character. He's down for it, it's just he gets there faster than the others. It creates an interesting juxtaposition that keeps him interesting, even when he's not really doing anything impactful to the plot at that moment. And I'm not going to get into it because you should watch this show, but the carnival's interesting, and Mr. Top Hat's an interesting villain. Again, he manages to be captivating every moment that he's on screen, just through the actor's performance. He comes across almost like a Joker meets Q meets an actor at a haunted house. It's a lot of fun. I genuinely don't know how I never heard of this. How did I not know this was a thing? Like, I'll say it from time to time when I'm talking about a show that's already done, that I wish I had gotten more into a show when it was running, or that I wish I had known about a show when it was running. But this is one of those ones where I feel like I missed out on something by not watching this when it was new. And it's not like it's not still newish, but still, I wish that I had had the opportunity to watch this show as the episodes were coming out so that I could savor it, rather than sit here and binge it. Because even though binging the first season was not an unpleasant experience, I don't know, I wish this had been one of those ones that I had watched in real time and each of the episodes had had a chance to percolate before I watched the next one. Which is why I might actually wait a little bit to watch season 2. I might let this first season sit with me first, if that makes sense. And while, again, I don't think this is going to, like, substantially frighten an adult, this is a show that is a reboot of a children's horror anthology that actually tries to be scary. Goosebumps is not trying to be scary, or if it is, it's doing a very bad job of it. But it really does feel like Goosebumps is just trying to be a supernatural drama. Something that might have some creepy imagery in there, or some creepy scenarios in there, but it's not actively trying to be horror. This is actively trying to be kid-friendly horror. Which, I don't want to compare it too much to Goosebumps, because they really are very different animals. But it is an area where it does things better than the Goosebumps reboot does. It's also not as uneven, at least so far, as the Goosebumps reboot. Granted, it has fewer episodes, its narrative is more concise, so it has fewer opportunities to be uneven, but I feel like this was a much stronger first season than Goosebumps got. So, like, straight up, if this is something that interests you, if this is a show that interests you, like, I'd watch this. If you watch the original, I'd watch this. Bring your kids, even. I think they'd get a kick out of it. And if you are someone who's already seen the show, if you watched it live, or if you caught it after the fact, kind of like I am, I want to know what you think. What do you think of this show? And try to remain spoiler-free, but what are your thoughts on the second and third seasons? Am I going to like those as much as I like the first one? I mean, this has a very respectable rating on, like, Rotten Tomatoes and stuff, so I kind of expect that it's going to remain pretty good, but I do want you guys' thoughts either way. And either way, I don't really have much more to say about this one. Like, I could say more stuff, but I don't want to get too spoilery here, because, again, you should watch this show. So, you know, let's get a discussion about those things that I said going in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well check out the description of the video, where there are links to my various social medias, as well as to where you can purchase the first 3 books in my book series. But with that, I hereby call this meeting of the Midnight Society closed.